Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those who are new here, my name is Nicki. I'm an author and an editor and I post videos here on YouTube about editing, writing, books and all the other things I love. We're here today because it's the end of the month, so it's time to give you a bit of roundup of what I've been reading. It's been another bumper reading month. I think there's over 20 books to go through, so we will crack on. First of all though, just a brief apology that I'm sitting in here using my webcam today and I'm not using my better quality camera in my reading room library. The issue is, as you would know if you've watched my video yesterday with my film and TV wrap-up, is that my husband's had night shifts. His presence around the house has restricted my capability of setting up my camera in there and recording. Plus, I've got various appointments and things going on tomorrow, so if I wanted to get them out on time, it was this or risk being late. So bear with me, I will be back to slightly better quality and more attractive background next month. So without any further ado, I will crack on because, as I said, we've got quite a few to get through. So first up, I'd like to mention a 5-star read, which was Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton. This was an absolutely amazing read. I actually first heard about Hamilton when I was doing research on Jean-Andre, who was a figure from the American Revolution on the British side, about whom I was very interested. And of course Hamilton wrote a letter to Washington on the occasion of Jean-Andre's execution, pleading for clemency. And so it made me wonder who this guy was. And it was only later that I've heard about the musical of Hamilton as well. I wanted to see the musical while I was in London back over Christmas, and unfortunately it was only just opening and tickets were just not available. So I had to forego that, though I've been enjoying listening to the CD. And so I decided to read a biography of Hamilton, and this one was absolutely amazing. Wonderfully written, really entertaining and interesting reading, and also very clearly well researched. So if you're looking for a biography of Hamilton, definitely recommend this one. Another 5-star read I received as a review copy from the publisher. This was a print review copy, and it was Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. I actually haven't read anything else by Naomi Novik, although I've been hearing really great things about Uprooted, so I do want to check that out in the future. But I came to Spinning Silver. I requested it because it sounded interesting. I love fairy tale retellings. Rumpelstiltskin is a great one, and I thought it looked like a very fascinating read, which it was. What I really enjoyed about it was it takes the Rumpelstiltskin fairy tale as its basis, but it's not wedded to it, if you know what I mean. It uses it, but it branches off as well into other elements of folklore, and I liked that it wasn't too restricted by its retelling. I thought the characters were brilliantly drawn. Miriam's a wonderful heroine. I liked that she has plenty of faults as well. She's not a perfect heroine, and some of her decisions, you know, potentially could be morally dubious, so that was interesting as well. My favourite character was the Starrick Lord. I was a little bit worried about him at one point in the story, but luckily things worked out in a way that pleased me in the end. So if you enjoy fairy tale retellings and folklore, and you enjoy a bit of fantasy, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say this is YA fantasy, but it's certainly suitable for YA and an adult audience. So it was a 5-star read for me. Do check it out. So moving on, I've got like a full page here, as you can see, to get through. So we'll crack straight on. Next up is a bought copy of The Well-Beloved and the Pursuit of the Well-Beloved by Thomas Hardy. I'm a huge Thomas Hardy fan, but this was one I hadn't gotten to yet. What's interesting about this book in particular, it's his last novel, and this edition comprises of both the novel form and the way it was released initially in serialised form, and the story was slightly different and he made some changes between the two, so that's really fascinating to see. This is kind of a culmination of the works he's been doing in his novels, looking at ideas of gender and ideas of the woman as an object of the male gaze in many ways. In some ways, Hardy was quite ahead of his time in his portrayal of women and how men viewed them. It's a really great story. Perhaps it's not my absolute favourite Hardy novel, and it's probably not one I'd recommend as a first read if you haven't read any of his work before, but it's really excellent. I really enjoyed it. Fascinating piece, wonderful characters, as always. Next up was another book I received from the publisher as a print review copy, and it's The Book of Ordinary People by Varley. And this is the story of several people living in modern day Melbourne and the way their lives interconnect because of their involvement or meeting with a woman who's an immigrant who's trying to make sure that her status stays so that she can remain in Australia. So it's an interesting look at ideas of immigration, race, how we relate to different people, and all up it was a 4-star read for me. It has some very timely issues for our modern age. However, I didn't always feel a deep emotional connection with what was going on and with the characters. I kind of felt quite detached as I was reading it, so I think that was the only fault I found with it, that I think I would have liked a little more emotional engagement. Next up was a book that I received from NetGalley, and it is Bound to Gods by Ava Chase. Now this is the second book in the Their Dark Valkyrie series, which is a slow burn reverse harem, and I enjoyed the first book. It's based on Norse mythology, as you might guess from the Valkyrie reference, and our Ari, our main character, has become a Valkyrie after her death because of the intervention of several of the Norse gods, including Loki and Thor. That happened in the first book, and they've been searching for Odin, who's disappeared and potentially been kidnapped. The second book finds them all trapped in this sort of almost a mirror universe in a way. It's masquerading as Asgard, but it's not really. And this book, in many ways, the action was a lot slower than in the first book. There wasn't so much happening, because the entire book related to them being trapped in this world, having to relive experiences from their past. So there wasn't a lot of plot movement, if you like. It didn't advance the plot very much, but it did really advance the characters in this second book. And we got a really great idea. She's drawing on a lot of Norse mythology for backgrounds for the characters, so Ari is getting to know the guys a little bit better. And it did also ramp up the reverse harem aspect, which was only slightly touched upon in the first book. So I definitely still enjoyed it. It was a 4-star read for me, and I would look forward to reading the next book to see what happens next, because I think the next book will be more advancing the plot again, which should be interesting. Next up was another NetGalley read. It was The Light Between Us by Katie Kahn. This was a 3-star read for me. It had a very interesting premise to do with time travel and science, the science of time travel, and there's an element of a romantic relationship as well, like whether a romance that didn't work in one world could work in a parallel universe, that you'd reach through this kind of time travel, interdimensional travel that goes on. It was, as I said, fascinating premise. However, it did lose me kind of midway. It started off with it looking like the focus was going to be on a particular aspect of the story, and then suddenly it went off on a completely different tangent, which did lose me a little bit. And although I kind of came back and was interested, but again by the end, that was a bit of a jolt, and it ruined my complete enjoyment of the book. Next up, another NetGalley, The Incurable Romantic by Frank Tallis. This is a 4.5-star read for me. It's non-fiction. Frank Tallis is a psychiatrist, and he basically has given us various examples, obviously anonymously, of different patients he's seen, and all of them have some issue to do with love. You know, one of them's ridiculously jealous. One of them's got this idea that she's fallen in love with her dentist, and she just believes he's in love with her, and there's no reason for her to think this. He's never done anything to make it seem that way, but she's completely obsessed with the idea that he loves her too, and she becomes a bit of a stalker. It was really fascinating insight into these different psychological issues relating to love, but all from different approaches. So if that's something that interests you, psychology, psychiatry, and particularly theories of personality and ideas around what is love and what makes us fall in love, this was a fascinating read for that. Next up, another NetGalley one, Practical Calligraphy by George Thomson. This is a 4-star read for me. It's a fairly basic, short introduction, so if you're someone who's been interested in learning some calligraphy but hasn't given it a try yet, this is a really good beginner's starter book for you. If you're someone who already does it and is looking for more in-depth knowledge, then this probably isn't what you're after, but for a beginner, perfect. Another NetGalley one, Ultimate Cover Letters by Martin John Yate. 4.5-star read for me. I actually requested this one because my husband needed to write a cover letter and I knew that was coming up. At the same time, I saw this requested on NetGalley, or available for request on NetGalley, so I picked it because I thought maybe it'll give me a bit of insight to help him, which it did. There was some really excellent information. The first part of the book is more general discussion on what you should put in the cover letter, but it was followed by a lot of, hundreds of pages of examples based on different types of employment. So there was something there that for everyone, whatever your job you're applying for, there were a couple of examples for you. So it was an excellent resource, I thought. Next up, London Letters by Lucy Stevens, which is another NetGalley read. This was a 4-star read for me. Now, this is a London guidebook, but it's with a really quirky difference. And it takes a different region of London, moving through the alphabet from A to Z, and picks out a few key places you might want to visit, whether for sightseeing, for food, entertainment. It was really quirky, fun, beautifully illustrated. However, it kind of depends what you want from a guidebook. If you've never been to London before and you want to see a lot of the big main sites, this is probably not for you. But if you're familiar with London and you're perhaps looking just for something a bit different, maybe some areas like Brixton or something that you perhaps wouldn't naturally go to as a tourist, it's not on the main big tourist jaunt, but as someone who's done all the big places, all the major sightseeing, you want something a bit different, then this definitely had a few things to offer in terms of ideas. So, and it's very prettily presented as well. So that was 4 stars for me. And sticking with NetGalley still, I read Beyond the Throne by Adrian Tinniswood. This was a 5-star read for me. This is a look at the history of England, essentially the history of the English royalty, through the backstairs or downstairs team of servants, which made it a bit interesting because I've read a lot on British history, so most of the major events that the book mentions were familiar to me. However, we were being shown them from the point of view not of the big main players, the royal family, the nobles, but from the people who were working behind the scenes in the kitchens or as press secretaries and private secretaries, things like that. So it had a really interesting insight, lots of brilliant stories that present things that you think you know in a new light. So definitely worth checking out if you enjoy royal history or English history. Sticking with NetGalley still, Letterform by Timothy Samora. This was another 5-star read for me. This is a book essentially looking at typography and the history of typography. It was a really excellent resource. It charts everything from the beginning of typography through to the modern day with examples of popular font styles from the 1990s, and so beautifully presented. It's a really attractive, easy to read book. So if that's something that interests you, I mean, definitely if you're a graphic designer, it would be of interest. And even to me as a layperson, I found it interesting to look at how letters are formed, but also how styles of typography and the preferred styles have changed over the years. Moving on to a book, another bought book, which was Grettir's Saga, one of the Icelandic sagas. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge fan of Norse mythology and the old Icelandic sagas. And Grettir's Saga is actually one of the most famous ones, but it's one that I hadn't read yet. It's quite interesting. I seem to have read a lot of the more obscure ones first, and I haven't gotten around to all the major popular ones yet. But Grettir's Saga and Njal Saga were on my list. I've got Njal Saga waiting, but I read Grettir's Saga this month. It's interesting. It's an outlaw story. So in that way it follows a familiar narrative looking at the sort of legal system of medieval Iceland. But at the same time there are all these wonderful supernatural elements. There's about 3 occasions when Grettir has to fight ghosts or deal with hauntings. And that I love that bit. I thought that was brilliant. This is actually a really approachable saga. If you haven't read any before and are looking for one to start with, I think this would be a good option for you because as I said, it's a standard outlaw saga in some ways, so you're getting a traditional Icelandic saga story, but the supernatural elements give it a bit of a fantasy boost, and although there are a lot of family relationships going on, it's not one of the most complicated in that regard. Some of them do get quite complicated with who's related to who, but this one is reasonably straightforward. And the edition I got, Oxford World Classics edition, had a lot of really helpful genealogy tables and maps showing his movements as an outlaw where he travels around the country. which really added to the experience and helped you visualise it when you've got a lot of movement and a lot of people coming here and there. So really enjoyable. I finished that last night, really loved it. Back to NetGalley now for Bitter Orange by Claire Fuller. This was a really interesting book, and it's one that's difficult to describe too much without giving it away, so I'm going to be careful. But essentially these people are living in an old house, essentially abandoned, and they're there in order to survey it for the American who's bought it. It's an English property. And it revolves around both their individual development, but also the way they relate to each other and how that affects their thoughts of the past and the future. It was a really interesting and twisting tale as a sort of element of a bit of a mystery story about it as well. However, I didn't always like the way the scene breaks were done. Sometimes it was a little bit jarring trying to work out where you were, what was going on, whose head you're in now. So that was the only thing that let it down a little bit for me, which made it a 4.5-star read. Next up, another NetGalley one, Illusion by Stephanie Elmas. This was a really fun and twisting tale. I gave it 4 stars. It's kind of a bit of a historical story, but also with a bit of a fantastic magical element going on. A sort of is he, isn't he query about this, the main character. Is he actually doing magic, or is it all just illusion? So it's worth reading if you're into those sort of tales. It's magical realism in an extent, I'd say, but with this potential that there is real magic going on somewhere. And also an historical background, historical setting, if that appeals to you. So again, it's one I'm just wary I can't say too much about it because there are a few twists that I don't want to give away, so I'll leave it at that. Sticking with NetGalley still, The King's Witch by Tracy Borman, which was an historical story set in the court of James I. This was 4.5 stars for me. I thought it was a really compelling historical fiction read. It takes elements from history and puts a sort of twist or supposition on them. So the main character, Frances, is a figure who existed, and Borman has interpreted how she might have lived in the court and what role she might have played. So there's obviously elements of witchcraft because she's a herbalist, sort of wise woman. She can heal people, and so with James I, obviously you're in a court where witchcraft and the persecution of witchcraft's rife. And James I was terrified of witches, so she's trying to negotiate her way through this court without getting caught out. Next up, another NetGalley read, Shipped by Karrie Roman. And this is an contemporary story about 2 actors who are playing characters that the fans love to ship, and eventually they end up pursuing a bit of a real-life romance as well, but there's a lot of problems going on with a potential fan who's becoming a stalker. So it was a really sweet romance, but it's also quite action-packed. There was a lot going on, and it was a 4-star read for me. And sticking with NetGalley still, Death Be Blue by Katie Epstein. And I gave this 4 stars. It's a paranormal mystery, and it had a really catchy plot, some quirky, memorable characters. So I enjoyed it. I thought it took familiar, there's plenty of paranormal mystery stories out there, but I liked the way this one had a little bit of a fresh spin on things. So definitely worth a watch, or worth a read, if I can speak properly. Worth a read if that's your genre. Next up, The Winter Riddle by Sam Hooker was another NetGalley read. This one I haven't actually put the review up on my blog yet because I'm saving it until a little bit closer to release day. But I will say that this was a 4-star read. It was fun, really quirky sense of humour, and it's blending things like Santa Claus with northern myth and the idea of witches, and really enormous fun. Again, it's one I don't want to spoil too much by giving away the story, but if you want something that's kind of a really quirky, comedic dark fantasy, then this is probably for you. Next up was a book I won in a giveaway. Yay! And it was The Book Ninja by Berg and Michelle Kalus, and this was a 4.5-star read for me. Now, these 2 ladies are responsible for the Books on the Train initiative, where you leave books on a train for other people to find and read and enjoy. And they've woven that idea into a story, a kind of contemporary romance story. Our main character has trouble with guys, and she thinks that maybe the problem is she needs to meet guys who are into the same thing she is, and she's a big fan of classic novels. So she goes around leaving classic novels on trains with her email address written in the back to see if she can meet Mr. Right. And as a result of this, she ends up going on dates with a wide range of different people, and she starts blogging about them. However, at the same time, she's met this guy with whom she's kind of hit it off. However, there's a problem, because he doesn't read classics, he reads YA. So she thinks they're completely mismatched. So the premise of the book is what's going to happen with all these dates she goes on, and is she going to be able to work it out with this guy, even though their literary tastes are so diverse. Great fun, as I said, really sweet. It's a bit of fluff, essentially, but it's fun fluff that you can just read in a couple of nights if you just want something light and easy. Next up, we're going back to NetGalley for Norse Mythology by James Shepherd. I gave this 3.5 stars. I thought it gets the 3.5 stars essentially because it is a really wonderful collection that combines all the Edda stories with the Volsunga saga and also a few other Icelandic sagas and lighter stories. So it was a beautiful selection, one of the best selections I've seen for a book on Norse mythology. However, I found the works in it really sanitised, and I couldn't understand why, because as far as I could tell it wasn't being promoted as a children's edition or anything like that, but a lot of the sort of more baldy aspects of the tales were just ignored or really dumbed down. I mean, in the tale of the building of Asgard's walls, that ends with Loki as a mare, as a horse, giving birth to Sleipnir, and that was just completely ignored, that bit. We didn't want to know about, guys gender bending and giving birth. And there were some other elements in other stories as well, where bits were just missed out or sort of really placed on the back burner, if you like, because they were more sexualised aspects of the story, which I thought was a real shame, because I could maybe understand it if this was aimed at children, but that didn't seem to be the case. So why were we not being given the full story, and why was this being sort of PG-rated versions? It found that a bit bizarre, which is why it only got 3.5 stars. Next up is another NetGalley read, Fallen for You by Jules D. And this is another paranormal-ish one. I say ish because it's kind of angels, but it's an interesting take on angels and on the premise of what angels are and where they come from. I gave it 3 stars. I really loved the premise. I thought this new take on angels was excellent. However, I did think there were a few issues with the characterization and the plot. It felt a little bit jumpy to me as it moved through different elements, and the plot elements kind of did relate together at the end, but it almost felt like there were several different stories, little stories going on, and at the end they were kind of brought together, but for me it didn't feel like a cohesive whole. And also the characterization of the romantic relationship, it kind of felt a bit sudden to me. We're told they're friends and they've always fancied each other a bit, but then all of a sudden they're in this deep romance and totally committed to each other, that they can survive all these important bonding ceremonies and various things that have to go on, which I struggled with a bit. I would have liked to have seen the development of that romantic relationship progress a little slower so that we could see it evolving, as opposed to being nothing and then suddenly everything. Next up was another one that I received via a win in a giveaway. I've been very lucky this month. And it is The Suicide Club by Rachel Heng. I gave this 4 stars. It was a really fascinating concept. It's the idea that in the future medicine has advanced to the stage where people can prolong their life for hundreds of years, and immortality is essentially within our grasp. They reckon they're nearly at a stage where they can make us live forever. But that, of course, leads to some people who don't like this idea, who want to be given the option of dying if they so choose, and these are members of the Suicide Club. So our main character is essentially a lifer to begin with. She's in the program. She is she's a high flyer. She's getting all the best updates and the best medical advances. But then various events occur, which I don't want to spoiler, but that sort of push her into the realms of the Suicide Club. And I don't want to say any more because I don't want to ruin it. But as I said, it's 4 stars because it is a fascinating concept. I didn't feel it was always brilliantly written in terms of our engagement with the characters and the emotional depth of the characters. It felt a little surface level, but it gets the 4 stars just because it was such a brilliant idea, and the idea is one that I think is interesting to explore. And finally, we've reached the end with Everless by Sarah Holland, and this is a book I actually received from a book swap. I'm in a Goodreads group in which some of us that live locally get together maybe once or twice a year for a catch-up and a chat. We have a bit of lunch, and we usually do a mystery book swap, so we wrap up a book with just a hint about what the genre is, and we do a swap. So I got Everless by Sarah Holland, which is a YA fantasy, and I gave it 4.5 stars. It's a really excellent premise, something a little bit different from the usual, but obviously with enough of the familiar tropes that it feels like a typical YA read as well. Again, I don't really want to give away too much of the story, but there's the obvious potential love triangle thing, the 2 guys, which one's she going to end up with. It's the beginning of what I assume is going to be a trilogy, and it left me at the end of book 1 definitely interested in reading on and seeing what would happen to the characters in book 2. So I will end there. As I said, it's been a huge bumper reading month, hasn't it? I'm about to crack on with, I've got a few NetGalley ones there to read. I'm also hoping to get through a couple more on my print to TBR pile, because I do want to clear my print TBR pile by the end of November. I think I've got about 7 sitting there at the moment, so it's not too bad. I'll try and do a couple a month, and that will get me ready for a new influx of books I always receive for birthday and Christmas in December. So that's the aim. I do hope to have a few new good ones to share with you next time, but I will close there for now, and I will see you all again very soon. Bye for now, everyone.